Hi. Welcome, ministers. Thank you for being here. So you saw what our audience told us about globalization. What's your perspective? Minister Mitov, would you like to start?
Well, always. First, thank you very much for being together tonight. It's a really huge topic to be discussed in 7 or 8 minutes, but I'll try to synthesize a little bit what I'll try to say. So first, usually when we think about globalization, we think economy and technology and the interaction between the different national economic environments. The truth is that after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that was exactly the approach which all the democratic countries took, and that's how we perceived it. We thought that free market, little by little, will serve as a vehicle for other values, for liberal democratic values, and it will be exactly the carrier through which, little by little, those values will be introduced in autocratic environments, and people will pressure their autocrats in order to change and liberalize their own environment. Even some people started talking about the end of history and so on. So I'll try to take a little bit more of a political or geopolitical perspective rather than economic one. What happened, though, was free market, basically, and free market mechanisms in the beginning probably were perceived as carriers as well of liberal democratic values into other environments, but the autocrats very quickly overcame this initial shock and started actually using this economic cooperation in order to gain more resources with which to basically continue, and not only continue, but increase the oppression on their own populations, and then started attacking us back. So basically, they accumulated resources with which right now they're trying to seed disarray in the democratic environment. That is my initial point. But when it comes to looking at the world right now and thinking about globalization, I'm deeply convinced that we need to start drawing lines and stop this indiscriminate cooperation with regimes who are trying to seed disarray in the democratic environment. The globalization right now, it needs to be looked more internally and into the democratic countries, and we need to start thinking about how to integrate ourselves, the European Union, the NATO countries, other democracies on global scale, and basically draw certain type of lines in order not to allow those regimes to continue feeding off the global economic cooperation, oppressing their own people and attacking us. Because globalization in economic terms, it is not given. It is not something that could not be destroyed or dismantled, and the Commissioner gave us a perfect example for that. That's how wars start, when different political systems are clashing on global scale. Globalization requires also common perceptions, unification around common standards on global scale, agreement around, let's say, moral standards and moral and economic rules, which are not only external or global, but also internal.
Well, I think that what Daniel actually told here just proves that trade, markets, and globalization are such powerful positive tools that they even work in an environment of authoritarian regimes. So the fact that China and Russia and such economies have been able to use globalization to also to get up as economies and benefit majority of their people, it shows that actually trade globalization is a strong positive. And the original question, if I remember correctly, was that has globalization been too fast? Yeah. Well, there I would say no, because the alternative would have been that we wouldn't have a more than a billion people, especially in China and India, getting out of absolute poverty to middle class. And if we would, let's say, halved the speed of globalization and trade during past 30 years, we would have maybe said that, okay, 300 million of those people should still be poor. And really, I think that that's quite rude to even ask. So I would actually answer a no, and I would disagree with the majority, unlike in all other polls tonight. At the same time, of course, majority took the right option, which was basically arguing for harnessing the globalization, and I agree on that as well, since at the same time as we have had the golden years of free trade and globalization and market economies since collapse of Soviet Union until financial crisis, we now have really seen the antithesis strongly coming with the populistic movements raising in all Western countries. And I really think that it would be a mistake now to lay back and take a glass of champagne and say that, okay, Mr. Macron will deal with all populism and he can just start doing things exactly at the same way as last decade. And here we need new kind of trade policies. For instance, I understand that people, workers in factories, they feel unfairness if they compete with such factories in such countries which don't obey their basic commitments to basic labor rules or environmental standards. And for example, in European free trade agreements, which we argue monthly in the Council of Trade Ministers, we have nice clauses about sustainable development and labor norms and environmental standards, but we don't have any tools actually to do something when the counterparty is not delivering what it's committed in. And there we should maybe look to actually what US has been doing already with several countries, being able to put sanctions if the other counterparty is not obeying its commitments.
Minister,
and that's something that we should explore to show people that we understand the unfairness.
You mentioned populism. Do you think that globalization is a byproduct of... do you think populism is a byproduct of globalization?
Well, mostly I think that the root cause of the populism is because of the technological change. And here the Commissioner Carlos told nice example of his radiologist, and that case actually defines the challenge in that way that yes, smart radiologists, they will find a way to use the opportunity to be even more earn even more by putting the machines to do the repeatable jobs and then be more in the creative side. But at the same time, the problem is that the less creative 30% of the radiologist class maybe finds themselves in a position that nobody actually wants to hire them anymore. And here we have a problem because, and it's, I would say, 80% because of the technological change, the intelligent machines which don't need any more people to do repeatable work with the machine, as it used to be in the previous century, that machines came and they increased the productivity of almost all workers with quite small training needed. But now we don't need more than anything else than creativeness from people, actually, more and more, and that's the challenge. Would you like to comment on populism? But
yes, indeed. Because
if you don't mind, I would like to actually go back to one of the biggest players in the world. Since you were the former Foreign Affairs Minister, you know that both US and the UK, they've been lately skeptical about globalization, and they are doubting the merits of globalization and of free trade. What do you think, what we should do to convince them of the contrary?
Your question is exactly related to what I was about to add, which I completely agree what was just said by the Minister, and wanted to add two more details which exactly play in the courtyard of the populists, but also in the trends which are globalization skeptical, mainly in the UK and the US, as we saw recently. So the first thing is when democracies or the democratic elites started building little by little legitimacy of the capitalist system, there was this connection between the ones who don't have much and those who do. It was the elites were perceived as elites of merit at certain points. People like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs were risk takers. Those are innovators. Those are people who are out there and who earned what they have. The problem lately is the disenchantment, the disconnection between and the Commissioner pointed that out as well, the disenchantment and the growing difference between those who have a lot and those who don't and struggle. The elites at the time, they were engaged in the community. In times of crisis right now, the problem is that the elites run away. They take their money because of globalization. They have the possibility to be way more mobile, and they just take their money and go away. Greece is a perfect example for that. When the crisis struck, then 120 billion by certain data was taken out of the country, and tightening of the belt fell again of those who don't have. And the other thing, between the democratic elites and the voters, always existed this connection with the voters were devoted to defending their country. They were workers and they were consumers. Right now, globalization created something different. Technology entered in the army. Professional armies no longer need everyone to be involved in defending their own country. Then working force enters because of globalization and the labor market. Cheap labor force can enter and substitute others. This was the effect to a great extent in the Rust Belt in the United States and voting for Trump. And consumerism no longer is restricted within national borders. Companies depend on global consumerism.
You mentioned voters just now. I would like to suggest something. I would like to take a bit of time and open the floor to our audience, to the voters, and see what they have to say about globalization, and if they want to ask any questions. So if you have a question, I would kindly ask you to raise your hand, introduce yourself, and be as short as possible.
Thank you for the floor. My name is Jarka Chlopkova, originally Czech, 20 years in Brussels building Europe. I would like to put globalization in the context of sustainable development. I was just speaking to Norwegian experts who told me that Norway is importing wood from Baltics. Obviously, they would not do it if it wouldn't make economic sense. So my question is, how do we keep globalization, but only the smart globalization? Thank you.
Thank you. Would you like to address the question to someone in particular?
No. To both of them.
All right. Let's take two more questions, and then we'll get to answers.
Thank you. Risto Niminen from Parliament Research Service. Question concerning a future of globalization, because we have to solve today's problems in order to have a future in globalization. And one problem is unequal distribution of the gains of globalization. Several studies have shown, for example, that in the US during the 30 last years, the growth of productivity and company gains has exceeded the growth of salary mass. So there has been a constantly increasing gap. So how you would solve this issue now in order to have a future?
Yeah.
You can take one more question if you are fine. And anybody else? Athanasius.
Thank you, Katarina. So I have a question for both ministers. How do you actually see globalization evolving within the next 10 years? Even more, there is a recent paper from the European Commission called Harnessing Globalization. I would like to have your comment also on that. But there's even a wider thing that I would like to ask you. Are we absolutely certain that we are not endorsing all the leftist propaganda that started in the early 2000s when I'm talking about globalization? Because, I've been covering this thing for more than 10 years. And the creed of the population actually has been formed by very, very specific people who, I wouldn't say were totally impartial when describing all these opinions. So are we absolutely sure it's a problem to harness or tackle, or should we let it? Let's begin now.
Thank you. Mr. Mykkänen.
Yeah, well, very good, smart questions. It's very hard to answer very quickly all of them. But first of all, about wood from Baltics, also Finland imports that sometimes. And I don't see any problem in that sense. If legally importing wood, legally importing cars, legally buying goods, what's the problem? Then it's another thing if the Baltic countries think that they should preserve more forests, then feel free to make legal actions on that, but that's not the problem. Then when we have emissions cross-border, then we should have a EU or international regulation on that. Well, then question about the jobs and the US productivity, that sense, and really much in the core of the topic tonight. And definitely when Trump is blaming Mexicans and China taking the jobs away, it's quite the opposite currently, because actually last year in US there were more cars produced in volume of produced cars than ever before. The value of industrial production is twice the amount it was 25 years ago. But at the same time there is about 250,000 less jobs in car industry in US because of the robots. So Trump should be blaming the robots, if somebody. But definitely that has been also a positive problem in that sense, that now that workforce can do something more productive and still we get the cars. But there's the problem, and I think that in the end, in all Western countries, we actually have to reform our labor markets and actually start also to find a way to subsidize the lowest wages. Because that's basically the only way how we can basically create high employment salaries according to productivity levels, but at the same time keep somewhat decent equality or fairness of the purchase power differences, because the productivity differences are increasing anyway because of technological change. But we should maybe also in EPP think more how we find negative taxation or basic income, which we are actually having an experiment on now currently in Finland, as you know, and let's see what we can find from there. Then question that are we actually talking about only populism and not any real problem maybe? Well, to some extent yes. As I said, I think that the blaming of trade, openness, and if that is globalization, then globalization is actually just finding something which is easy to blame, which is abstract, and everybody can hate something like that, and easily people are usually against of foreigners, so that is linked to foreigners. But then the underlying challenge is the labor market structure and the productivity differences, and there I think that we have to find some kind of solution if we won't accept like huge differences in purchase power between individuals according to their productivity. So I think I'm a bit, I at least have that small social democrat in my heart, that I want to get people to feel fair in labor market, but of course we shouldn't kill the wrong duck here.
Thank you, Minister. Minister Mitov, would you like to start with the journalist question?
Yes, indeed. I'll try to combine my answer and be sure that I give my perspective. So first, when we speak about sustainable development and globalization, I've been always defending the idea that when it comes to sustainable development, we cannot think only in economic terms. That's what I'm trying to explain all the time. Politics comes first. Globalization, if goes too quickly, it creates, and this is the conservative in me speaking, if it goes too quickly, it creates cultural and political shocks first. The economies might be fine for a while, but the conflict comes from politics, from systems, from political systems, because they interact with each other. When economies interact with each other, political systems also collide. And very often, and the principle in international relations is that countries export what they believe inside. They cannot export anything else. If you don't believe human rights are important, you will never defend them outside. If you don't believe freedom of speech is important, you will never defend it and never care about it. If you don't think corruption is a problem, that's exactly what you will export to other countries with your capital. That's, for example, one of my problems with the Russian influence. When Russian business and Russian capital goes to another country, they export the ways how the Russian institutions function and the ways how business is done in that country. And that is valid for every country. That is why sustainable development is related to what we believe in, to values. And people run away not only from bombs, they run away from corruption, they run away from lack of rule of law. They run away from corruption. And that is exactly where we need to tackle the problems of the sustainable development. And you're absolutely right when you raise this question. And as well, the skepticism towards globalization going too fast with me is very, very much alive because of the cultural and other implications. Because exactly of this interaction between political systems, and we need to be quite careful. That's why I'm always saying we need to start drawing lines and be sure that we integrate the democratic countries around the world economically more and more. We need to globalize democracies first and draw certain lines with the other regimes because they're trying to hurt us, and that's very obvious. The minister was saying before that if it walks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, and everything else, then it's a duck. Well, yeah, if it is if it walks, talks, and quacks like an autocracy, that's what it is, and that's what is going to bring you.
Thank you, Minister. We have very short time left, and we have time for one more question, if anybody.
Yes, please. Thank you very much. My name is Jimmy Bustings. I work in the European Parliament. And I was wondering, I believe both Ministers Mitov and Mykkänen mentioned values and the intrinsic values that we represent also as Christian Democrats within the EPP. But I believe Mr. Mykkänen told about subsidizing the lowest wages. Now, one of the possibilities often raised to mitigate the risks of globalization for especially the poorest people is a universal basic income. How would you or both of you believe that may or may not undermine the intrinsic value of work and actually the contribution that people deliver to a society based on what they produce and what they deliver to someone else, and actually get some economic gains from that in return?
Yeah. Thank you. So the question from what I understood was addressed to Minister Mykkänen. Let's take one from Minister Mitov. Is the microphone?
Thank you. I have a question for Minister Mitov. You know, we as humans are messy, and there is no good idea that we can't mess up after a certain period of time. So when you see us as humans in historic context, you know, we like things that we don't like. When we have something, we want something else. So when we get it, then let's change it, let's test it, experiment it, and so on and so forth. So how do you think that this idea is going to float in the next couple of decades with our human nature that is very, very divergent, let's say, put it mildly? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister Mykkänen, please.
Yeah, well, good question about the universal basic income. And starting this January, we have an experiment in Finland that we chose by lottery 2,000 unemployed people who now get 560 euros per month, guaranteed whatever they do. If they start their business, if they are hired, they still get it. And of course, the results will be seen much later, but anecdotal evidence from the interviews and that kind of things show that at least all of those who have been interviewed, they feel like huge empowerment, that now they can take some plans that they have had about starting some activities and some own business or asking about common projects with their friends or counterparties, which they before were hindered by the fact that they were afraid that the social security benefits will be taken away if they show wrong kind of activism and work and business. So in that sense, at least in Nordic conditions where we actually have a problem that our social benefit system passivates people, I think that that challenge in basic income, that it would hinder people from doing things and from using their strength and creativeness, that is not that relevant. Much larger problem is that if we have a really universal basic income credit, it should be much higher than 560 euros per month, and then we should finance it basically by having higher marginal taxation in the level of middle class, and then we wouldn't have that hard unemployment trap, especially from bureaucratic point of view, but then the income trap of whether you are better off by taking better job when you are already middle class people, then there is certain problems of fairness and problems of effectiveness. But I think that actually people would be using their strength and positive skills much more if they wouldn't have to think all the time that, okay, now I might lose more than get if I take a job or start a business. And especially in the world where actually there is no high salary job for everybody and the productivity differences are growing, so all activism or activities should be rewarded, even the smallest ones, and you should always feel that you get something out of that and still you are taken care of.
Thank you, Minister. Minister Mitov.
Very shortly, Vlatko, you asked me almost a theological question. I mean, the faultiness and the imperfection of the human nature, where mankind has tried ages and ages somehow to find a recipe, and I'm not really sure that I'll be able to give you one now. But what I know for sure is that we need more discipline in defending our values. I mean, the Western democracies, which have gained a lot of ground in the last 25 years, the world has become more democratic, undeniably. We need to defend ground right now. Discipline in defending our values and putting those values in front of sheer desire for economic cooperation with everyone at all costs. That's one thing. And second, this conflict which I was talking about between democracies and autocratic regimes right now, it exists whether we see it or not. It's there. What we need to remember as well, put in historical perspective, is that this argument has started during the Enlightenment period. It's not new. That was the conflict in the 18th century between the United States and Europe. Then I remember this always as an example in my mind, the two great French thinkers, Alexis de Tocqueville and Marquis de Custine. One supporter of liberal democracy wrote his famous Democracy in America, and the other one, supporter of the absolutist monarchy, went to Russia to try to prove the absolutist monarchy is the best way to govern, stayed there for 10 years, wrote 3 volumes, and returned a liberal in 19th century terms. So that's what we need to do right now, basically. Try to understand where we are and defend what we believe in and what has led us to progress and to what we have. As the Minister was mentioning, 1 billion people right now have more than what they had in the past.
Thank you, Ministers. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so we'll have to close it here. But there's no better way of ending this debate, and we're ending on a talk about our values. So thank you very much, and thanks to the audience for an active participation. And it's been a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.